All right. Welcome to All Things Odd. I'm Dr. Natalie Phillips.
And I'm Dr. Hannah Galloway.
All right. So I'm going to have Dr. Galloway talk real quick as we share this out to some of our forums about our YouTube channel there.
Yes, so you can see all our little thumbnails there. I think it's easier to tell what the show's about when you look at YouTube. So if you see up there in the top right corner, it's subscribe. We only have 8 subscribers, so there's only room for improvement. But we're slowly getting more people. I think a lot of people watch our show on Facebook, but this is kind of neat if you have somebody that doesn't use Facebook and you want to send them the link or something like that. If we have an episode that interests you. So you can subscribe on YouTube and then you'll be notified when we have new content every Thursday.
Okay, and I'm laughing here because as I shared this out, I put it in one of our groups and I posted one of our links that we're going to be talking about as well. So that's kind of funny, but I'm going to have Dr. Galloway kind of kick us off with our topic first of all. So yeah, let's talk about why we're doing this show.
So our topic today is, are you hearing me? So hearing and listening are different. And we get a lot of complaints, especially from couples, that somebody has selective hearing or is, they should have heard me, but they didn't. Like, I can't tell if they're ignoring me. What is this? So today we're kind of doing a show on talking about the difference between hearing and listening and kind of what makes that up.
Yeah. All right. And so I also kind of thought that it was kind of funny because, this came from, our patient discussions. I know that some of the times that we are talking to patients, like what Dr. Galloway said, usually it's a spouse or somebody kind of joking around. But, we recommend often to have our patients actively listen, whether it's getting a hearing aid. We explained that, getting hearing aids doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get normal hearing entirely, right? And then also, with sound sensitivity and music therapy, I was explaining to a patient about music therapy and how to actively listen and use music, and really explaining what actively listen means to them. And so we thought that this was kind of interesting to be able to talk about. And then the last reason why we were kind of thinking about this topic is because I was noticing when I was watching different things, because I was talking about watching television with a patient. And I was noticing that, he was talking about different dialects, how he has to actually pay more attention. And I was talking about I totally understand what you're talking about. Like when I watch Shakespeare, it's almost like I have to get into a mode of thinking and really actively listen. And once I kind of get in this area of, okay, now I get what they're talking about in however they're talking, how they're delivering it, then it totally starts to make sense. But if something distracts me, it's like, what? And then all of a sudden I'm like, no, I have to sink back into this, being able to pay attention. And so, this topic of actively listening, we thought was kind of interesting to talk about. If you are just joining us, I see that there are people here watching. If you're an audiologist, chime in and let us know what your thoughts are. If you are somebody that notices this difference between hearing and listening as we talk through some of these different points, then we would love to hear from you as well. So, okay. So we're going to first talk about hearing versus listening. I'm going to have Dr. Galloway talk about that real quick. Oh, no, that's me. Okay. So actually, I thought this was kind of interesting because when I talk about the neurophysiological model of how sound moves through the brain, right? When I work with tinnitus patients and sound sensitivity patients, we talk about how it goes from detection, sound goes from detection in the subcortical level of your brain up to the cortical level of your brain, where now you're perceiving it, evaluating it, spending a higher level of brain activity. Then it goes to the limbic system where you have emotion and feeling. And then you've got the autonomic nervous system, right? Where you've got physiological responses coming out because of sound. So that's kind of going through that whole mechanism. And so I think it's really interesting because when we talk about hearing versus listening, hearing is really something that's passive. It's something because your hearing mechanism is always on. You can't close off your ears, right? And so it's always working. Sounds are always coming in to that hearing mechanism and being heard, and it's involuntary. So it's very passive. Versus listening is more where it requires attention, focus and attention, maybe a concentrated approach to trying to understand what you're hearing. And it's a choice to listen, or a choice to hear, but it's using the higher level of brain activity when you're listening. And so it's more of an active process versus hearing is a more passive process. And then once we talk about hearing over to listening, and then listening to learning, as you're learning, what I love, because I've got a business surrounding connection, is really listening to learn, which then leads to connection. But I love talking about this because as audiologists here, especially in our practice, both Dr. Galloway and I really believe in connecting to patients, right? And so when we describe what we do, we don't help people hear better, we don't help people listen better, but we help people connect better to whoever they need to connect to, their life, right? And so as Dr. Galloway talked about in the first kind of example of patients coming in, their spouse is saying, oh my gosh, like you need to test their hearing because they're not hearing me very, or they're not listening to me, is usually the complaint. And then we can kind of see what they're doing with their hearing mechanism. We can talk them through and counsel about how we can help them hear and listen better. But ultimately, the reason why we're doing this is because we both believe in connecting patients back to their spouse, to their loved ones, to their life. And so that's what we do, is we connect people back to that. So we wanted to bring up hearing versus listening, and then we wanted to also bring in how important the connection piece was as well. All right, so we've talked about hearing versus listening. Now, I know this is kind of funny, but we're going to talk, everybody kind of laughs and giggles about this, but let's talk about what really is selective hearing, and that's Dr. Galloway.
Yes. So I, in graduate school, took a whole class, a whole semester of psychoacoustics. And it was actually my favorite class because it's all about the psychology of sound and how our brain perceives sound. So I always bring up to patients, it's like the way that you see the color blue might not be the way that I see the color blue. And the way that you hear the C note on the piano might not be the way that I hear it. So a lot of it is all of our perception, right? And so people talk about selective hearing or selective listening, that you actually, somebody tunes things out that they don't want to hear. It's not a disorder. We all do that, and we're born with that ability. So because we're born with two ears on our heads, we actually have the ability to listen with this side and then listen with this side. And then the brain sort of brings it all together and makes a call on what that person said and kind of cancels out, whatever was the background noise or not the salient message. And so hearing is, sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's when we talk about selective hearing, it's actually a normal brain function to be able to do that. And when people have hearing loss, they're actually not able to do it as well as when somebody has normal hearing. So my favorite sort of thing to talk about is the cocktail party effect. So if you've ever been at a party, and let's say you're sitting completely by yourself, like at a wedding reception or something. Wedding reception is a good example because usually there's like a table of 12 people or something. And you can literally look at a couple right there talking and listen to their conversation. And then, okay, look over here and then listen to what those people are saying. And the reason you have that ability is because you're using selective hearing or the cocktail party effect. So we're actually able to kind of separate what we hear. When you have a little bit of hearing loss, that is more difficult. And so patients will actually describe that to me and say, I used to be able to like overhear people's conversations and be able to like focus in on different conversations. And now I can't do that. Well, let's say somebody has bilateral hearing loss that's in the high frequencies. This ear is missing that part of the message, and so is this ear. And so that person can't sort of zoom in on the conversation as much because they're having to fill that information in. And so we have a link that's actually a psychology article that talks about the cocktail party effect. And I was interested in reading that because in 1953 is when that was first sort of introduced. And somebody named Colin Cherry did some experiments to kind of see how we handle that. And the first experiments he did was a recorded speech. So one person saying two different sentences presented to the patient in both ears at the same time. So it's literally the same person saying two different things at the same time and then trying to get the study participant, to be able to listen to one and reject the other. When there's no cues, like it's actually just all coming at you from the front, that's really hard to do. And so then they did some second experiments where they put one message on this side and one message on this side. And suddenly people were so much better able to repeat the message back. And what's interesting is that when we tell you, okay, we're only going to have you repeat back what you heard on the right, ignore on the left. People ignored it to the point that if they changed the speech to German, they didn't notice. Or if they played the speech backwards, they didn't notice, because we call it binaural separation. You're actually able to totally separate the signals and ignore one and listen to the other. Dr. Phillips and I were talking about this because we test patients for auditory processing disorder. And there are two different subtests. One is looking at binaural separation, so your ability to actually separate that information. And another subtest is looking at binaural integration, so you being able to take those two signals and actually merge them together. And what I found that's so interesting is patients with auditory processing disorder have a lot different abilities when it comes to this. So I had a patient recently who has auditory processing disorder, and she was great at the binaural separation piece. So when I told her, ignore this side and just tell me what you heard over here, she did great. She got like 100%. But then when we had her listen on both sides and integrate, she did really, really poorly. And that kind of speaks to real world, because you walk around in the real world listening on both sides and then integrating. So when we talk about selective hearing, selective listening, not everybody's ability is the same. And especially somebody who's neurodivergent or neuroatypical, maybe somebody, they process things completely differently. So selective hearing isn't a bad thing. It's actually a really good thing that you have the ability to do that. And not everybody's ability is as strong as the next person. So you can look at that article and kind of read more about the cocktail party effect. But yeah, we've been talking about this since 1953. So that's really cool that somebody was actually looking at it then. I kind of want to go back to my psychoacoustics textbook and see about that part, because I don't specifically remember it. But so that is, selective hearing is real, and it's actually a benefit. So there's nothing wrong with someone that's selective hearing. They're just sort of prioritizing the signals to the brain in the way that's going to help them the most, or the way that they think is going to help them the most. So sometimes, like small children, they just don't even process what you've said because they're overwhelmed with sound signals. So they have a very immature brain, and their auditory processing skills are not as strong as an adult. And so they have to just prioritize what's the most important information to address. So it may seem like they completely ignored something when really that's just their brain trying to help them function in the world.
I love that, except the one thing I don't love is that, okay, so what I heard was selective hearing is good and it's not a disorder. And so I'm hoping my husband does not watch this right now, because every time I'm like, oh my gosh, you just have selective hearing, he's probably going to say, it's a good thing, but yeah, so that's why I thought it was kind of funny to talk about, because and do a little bit more research on it so that we can talk about it more professionally, versus the whole joke about men or spouses having selective hearing. And I say spouses because it could go the other way, right? As well, but it's actually a good thing. So
and I actually my patient with auditory processing disorder was telling me that she was giving me an example of, she was with somebody super close range. She has normal hearing. They said something to her, and it was like her brain didn't even process that the sound existed. And then whoever spoke to her readdressed it later and said, well, I asked you this question and you didn't respond. And she's like, oh, I didn't even hear you at all. She did hear them, but she wasn't listening. So her brain was trying to help her with whatever tasks were at hand, and she was trying to simplify. But to that other person, it seemed like maybe she totally didn't hear them. And I thought that was interesting because it sort of demonstrates a more immature auditory processing system. We would expect something like that in small children, and it does happen in adults too. It's just sort of how you're prioritizing, and we're always trying to help ourselves. So if there's too much stimuli, we're kind of trying to funnel it down to what's the bare necessities to move forward in this conversation. I also had that same auditory processing disorder patient told me that she would, in conversation with somebody, memorize one of the words that they said and repeat it back to herself the entire time they were talking, so that when she responded to them, it seemed like she was listening, but she wasn't.
Oh,
because
wow.
she didn't have the ability to totally capture and understand what they were saying. So if they said, something about their daughter Lily, then she would bring up their daughter Lily so that she could show to them that she was trying, but she actually had no idea what they said.
Hmm.
So I thought that was really, really interesting because
Yeah.
that was her coping mechanism so that other people didn't think she wasn't processing when she wasn't processing.
Mhm.
So
Interesting. So, in regards to that, like just researching for the show, so learning about different things, right? Maybe changing the way we look at things, right? With selective hearing, we found some other really cool things that happen, and we wanted to talk about that. So, okay. So, in researching the show, we thought, okay, well, what is the opposite of selective hearing? And what we found was that it is really called insulated listening, which is maybe ignoring or avoiding information or certain topics of conversation. And I feel like sometimes we all do this, right? This insulated listening. I didn't know there was a term for this,
I didn't
but
either.
if you're kind of avoiding or ignoring, trying to have this conversation, it's called insulated listening, which I thought was kind of interesting. And we thought we'd put it out there
There's
because I didn't even know there was a
There's
name.
definitely a psychology term for that that's like avoiding the topic. I
Yeah.
can't remember what it is, but it's like just so it's not insulated listening, but there's another term for that when in conversation you totally just avoid the one topic and like
Right.
skirt
Right.
around it like they didn't even talk about it.
Yeah, so I had no idea. Okay, the other kind of cool term, and we wanted to put it out there too. Okay, I hope I say this right, is auditory pareidolia. So, again, there was a scientific article that we found when researching for this show about this term, auditory pareidolia. And I know that some of our audiologist friends, as they're scrolling, probably will stop because they're like,
Oh.
what is this? Right? Okay.
Mhm,
So, this is when you hear a random noise and perceive words from this erratic jumble of sounds.
mhm,
So, for example, those shows that show people going in recording some paranormal activity,
mhm,
and they have this EVP, or it's called an electronic voice phenomenon, where they feel like, yes, we were in this paranormal area and we did this recording, and did you hear that? Like, totally,
yeah,
did you hear that? Right. And it's like, some people are like, I don't even know what you're talking about, but they're like, no, there's somebody speaking right now. And they actually hear words
mhm,
when recording this. And so that's auditory pareidolia. Okay. So to explain it better too, because some people might be like, what? Yeah. Okay. Is another term that we found that would explain it, but in visual terms. Okay. So this is called apophenia. So
is this
this
like the white dress versus the pink?
no, this is like when people actually see a connection. Okay, so
Mhm,
remember how we talked through that whole brain activity of hearing, but this is with eyes now. So
okay,
when people can actually see a connection or see these meaningful patterns in unrelated random things. So
okay,
I guess this wouldn't necessarily be, well, okay. So one example would be like gamblers who actually see patterns in numbers.
mhm,
Okay, so that would be referring to this apophenia,
mhm,
apophenia. Okay, or more commonly, when people are looking at the surface of a moon through like a telescope, or looking at clouds, and you see images of not necessarily rabbits, but like Jesus, or like a man in the moon, or something like that, like an
ink
actual
blot test.
pattern. Yeah, yeah. So that would be kind of like we talked about auditory pareidolia, but it would
Mhm.
be more apophenia, which, like, look at me just having these terms now roll off of my tongue. 'Cause- but it was just interesting researching for the show,
Mhm.
and talking about some other terms that came up to explain some different random things that are going on. But it had to do with, it pointed me that way to those terms with looking up, selective hearing and listening and all of that too. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. So we thought we would kind of talk about that. All right. So then we thought, okay, but what about multitasking, right? So sometimes, like when we start the show, I'm trying to share some different things out. Well, Dr. Galloway is talking.
Mhm.
Sometimes when she's talking, though, if she moves on to a different point, I might not necessarily be hearing it right because I'm multitasking, right?
Mhm.
And so, at first in multitasking, I used to be, I mean, I am a multitasker, and I used to think like, Oh my gosh, like it's so good to be a multitasker, right? Until I found out that it's actually not a good thing to be
Mhm.
a multitasker. And it's funny because Dr. Galloway knows I'm a multitasker. So she'll be talking to me, and sometimes I can kind of get it while I'm doing something else. But there was one time where she's like, okay, I'm just going to text you this because I saw that you were doing something while I was talking to you, and I just need you to remember this. And
Like, I feel
I
like
don't
you weren't actually listening.
I'm not even too sure if you remembered it, but it's just a reminder for you to do something.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of cool. But multitasking does pose a problem. So I
Mhm.
read the book The One Thing, and I thought initially that the book was going to be about like focusing on different things in your career or whatever it is, right? And that it's important to focus on the one thing. But it went back a step, and it really talked about how when you don't focus on one thing, your brain actually splits off and you're not able to
Mhm.
focus 100% to get that task done. So, really, you're splitting your brain particles almost, and you're not able to really focus and get that task done correctly, efficiently, and sometimes
Mhm.
even right. Right. And so, multitasking is not a good thing. And I found an article that states that multitasking significantly decreases performances on listening and both writing tasks. So, actively listening means you are 100% zoned into what the speaker is saying and doing. And so, that's what we say when we say we want you to actively listen, right? So,
Mhm.
even with hearing aids, a lot of people put hearing aids and expect the hearing aids to, like, for them to just sit back and not have to worry about it. Like, the hearing aid should be able to pick up everything. Not
Mhm.
necessarily. So, when we fit you with hearing aids, we explain that your hearing doesn't necessarily go back to 100% normal hearing, right? But we're amplifying over a damaged ear. And so we
Mhm.
strongly recommend to still have these habits and practices of actively listening because it's super important to key in. And so Dr. Galloway is going to talk about active listening a little bit more, but also some other things that to consider when we talk about active listening.
Mhm. Yeah, so the actual definition of active listening is a way of listening and responding to another person that improves mutual understanding. And so we've all been in a situation where somebody is paying attention to you, but you can tell you don't have 100% of their attention. And like in that example Dr. Phillips gave, I knew she was kind of involved in whatever task she was doing. And we were talking, I was like, okay, go do this thing. She's like, okay, I will. And, while she's doing other things. And then when she left, I was like, I don't know if she's going to remember to do that thing because she was so involved in whatever else she was doing. So, I just sent her a message like, hey, just a reminder to do this in case you didn't, have it on your list or whatever. Um, and we have, kind of some barriers to active listening, which seem pretty obvious, external distractions. If you're doing something else, or if you're distracted by another sound signal or something like that, it's going to be hard. One thing that we all do, which is horrible, is you're watching TV and you're scrolling through your phone, looking through like Facebook or whatever. And like, yes, you're watching your show, but you're not actively listening. So if something happened in the show that was like fast paced or whatever, you would be more likely to miss it because your brain is also doing something else at the same time. Speaker distractions. So if someone else is actively talking, or let's say you're watching the show and then your significant other comes in the room and asks you a question and you're like, wait, what? Because I was so engrossed in my show. I was not even, I'm not actively listening to you. So speaker distractions, message intent or semantics. Sometimes you're in your own head, like, well, what did they mean by that just now? You're kind of like replaying it to yourself and trying to understand it. And then you're not actively listening. That is sort of reminding me of people with hearing loss because, I saw a patient this morning with high frequency hearing loss in both ears. Every time someone says something to her, she's actively trying to fill in that high frequency portion of speech. So she is thinking about their message intent, trying to fill that in. There's no way she's completely present for the next sentence because she's trying to go back and like fill in what there was before. Emotional language, that's kind of the same, trying to interpret what someone means by that. And then personal perspective. I'm also going to add just neuroatypical people or neurodivergent. ADHD would be a huge barrier to active listening
Mhm.
because your brain is literally trying to do 400 other things at the same time, and you can't just focus on the one thing. or auditory processing disorder. This show has kind of made me recall a few things that I have 2 patients that have pretty significant APD with no hearing loss. And they have a lot harder time. Like the woman that I was just talking about, she would memorize a term so that she could make you think she was active listening when she in fact had no idea what you said other than that one word. And that was just her trying to cope. But there's 5 key elements of active listening. So number 1, pay attention. 2, show you're listening, which is what that patient was trying to do, even though she knew she wasn't listening. 3, provide feedback. So, kind of recap what they were saying or give us some sort of a little response of something that they said. Defer judgment and respond appropriately. And some of this is just language usage too, pragmatic. So when is it appropriate for you to respond and show that you understood what they said? You don't want to interrupt them. That's not appropriate language usage. But I could see how somebody with ADHD or my patient with APD who's just desperate to memorize the word and bring it back to them would want to interrupt and use inappropriate pragmatics just because they're trying so hard to show that they're listening or listen. And so those are kind of the 5 key elements of active listening. I think we've all been guilty of not active listening. And there have been times when, like in the example of a show, I'm watching a show, I'm on my phone. Maybe my husband missed that episode and then he watches it again. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know any of that happened because I wasn't actively listening. I was on my phone and doing other things at once. So it's kind of like classic mom brain too, just having a toddler at home because moms are typically doing 100 things at once. Women try to multitask more than men. And I think studies have shown that women are better at it than men. But like Dr. Phillips said, you're not doing anything well when you're trying to do a lot of things at the same time. So what can we do to help our patients with this? Number 1, not every patient is the same. And that's a big conversation that I have with patients. Just because the textbook says that this hearing aid is what's going to be best for you, doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going to be best for you because it depends on your life, your motivation, how you're going to use it, what is your job, what are your listening environments. There's a lot of different things that kind of come into play. And so we do talk to people about, yeah, you can't just put these hearing aids on and then go sit in the back and expect that you're going to get 100% of what is said. Number 1, your brain has to learn how to use these hearing aids. So it's not your natural hearing. And there was probably some gap between when you had normal natural hearing and when you got these hearing aids. So we sort of have to reteach your brain how to use those cues of timing. So which ear heard it first, intensity, which ear heard it louder, and then those skills of binaural integration and separation that we just talked about, hearing both and sort of integrating it or being able to completely separate those messages. So we just try to help our patients functionally. If you're going out to dinner with your family, the most important thing is that you can hear what's going on at that table. And so there might be an accessory we could recommend, to use. Might not be a perfect situation, but it's going to be a better way to functionally hear your family than if you're just wearing your hearing aids or if you don't have hearing aids. So I think that's kind of our goal too, is to find what accessories might help you. Is there a tool on your iPhone or your Android on the app? Some of them allow for directional focus. I was talking to somebody about forward focus earlier. That's a way to help yourself that you already have the tool on your phone, but it's just something that I can bring up and remind you of that in that moment you might not be thinking of. With natural hearing and not wearing hearing aids, I don't have the ability to forward focus on my phone. I mean, my brain can do that for me, but hearing aids are super sophisticated these days, implants too. And so we actually have those abilities to kind of go in and redirect some things. So that's kind of our big thing for patients is just how are we going to, make you function better in your life for the things that are important to you with these devices or by adapting devices. So we hear a lot about, listening and hearing, and it is a different thing. So we've all been guilty of not active listening and know what that feels like. And so I think this show is just kind of a good reminder too, that 1, our brain is super sophisticated and can do all of these things. And 2, if you have a little bit of hearing loss, you may actually have to work harder to kind of do the same thing, but we can help you with different tools or, devices or accessories or whatever. So,
Yeah. And I think that one of the biggest things too, for just kind of my final thoughts on this whole show too, is that, with hearing loss, it's something that people can't necessarily see, right? And so the result by not getting appropriately amplified is that you start to disconnect from people, right?
mhm,
And you start to lose that connection, like we talked about. That's so important for us to help you get back. And so with whether it is learning about how to actively listen, learning how to, focus, or reduce distractions. It really is talking about some listening strategies to have in your pocket. But
mhm,
then, really, it is exactly what Dr. Galloway said, too. It's really part of getting the other person to understand that you're hearing them and you're trying to listen, right? But you're trying to actively listen. And
mhm.
so, you're really trying to get that other person to know that you're making that effort, right? And
Yep.
so with this whole active listening topic, we talk about it a lot in our practice with our patients. We wanted to educate people that might be watching this, if you're not an audiologist, to think about that as well, and to really start learning about how to actively listen and how that's going to improve your connection back, right? So not
Mhm.
only with the hearing aids and the amplification, but using that active listening and using some listening strategies to help you get that connection back. But yeah, we thought this was kind of be a fun topic.
Well,
All
and
right.
it can happen, like we've talked about people with differences like APD or ADHD or whatever. If you're
Mhm.
somebody watching this show that goes, "Oh yeah, I'm really good at hearing, but I'm really bad at listening," there may be other factors at play that could be helped. And so we've talked before about hidden hearing loss or people coming in and saying, on a hearing test, it's normal, but I don't understand my roommates or I don't understand this or that. We may be able to find something out to help you.
Mhm.
Because, like in the situation of a patient with auditory processing disorder, there are therapies that can be done. Hearing aids can be used to help sort of simplify the signal so that it's a little bit easier for the person. But you don't know what you don't know. And let me tell you that, 20 years ago, even people were not looking for some of these things. You could have grown up
Mhm.
with classic auditory processing disorder, but no one had a name for that. And certainly no one was testing for it. So
Yeah,
there's definitely
absolutely.
personal differences too that we can sort of investigate for you if you feel like there's somebody who's really good at hearing, but very bad at listening. So,
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, send us your questions, send us your comments. And with that, we are going to end the show for today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching the replay. Share this out if this was something that you think somebody can learn from. And we will see you next week, Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time with a whole new episode of All Things Odd. All right. We'll see you later.
thank
Bye.
you. Bye.